I know you well already. So.
Family
Good morning, everyone. My name is David Grant. I have the pleasure of moderating this panel. Unlike some of the panels where people are just meeting each other, this group is a little different. They, they know each other well, and this is a chance to pause for a moment and think about one family foundation, the Surdna Foundation in New York City. Quite remarkable in the constellation of family foundations for a couple of reasons. Longevity of governance under a single family, which I think we'll talk quite a bit about. Size and influence of the foundation, founded by John Andrus in 1917, and then funded in a sort of ad hoc basis until his death in 1935, the first of 3 trusts that were released associated with different groups of people. Now a billion-dollar foundation. So a remarkable player on the national scene. We have a chance this morning to talk with a 4th generation family member, Libby Andrus, a 5th generation family member, Kelly Nowlin, and the president and CEO of the Surdna Foundation, Phil Henderson. I'm going to just ask them to introduce themselves in a couple of sentences about sort of just to get us oriented about so how long they've been on the scene, and then we'll launch into some questions, and not too far into it, we'll turn to you and see what's on your mind as well. Libby, will you start?
Sure. As he said, my name is Libby Andrus, and I live in Minnesota. And I have been on the board of the Surdna Foundation for 27 years. I came on when I was 3 years old. Actually, I came on when I was 40, which was the average age of board members coming on the foundation. And I have been on almost every committee of the foundation. Fortunately, I've not been on the finance or the investment committee, or we would not be approaching $1 billion today. But I did chair the foundation for 5 years, and I chaired the Arts Now Thriving Culture program for probably 15 years. Also served on the Environment Committee and a program and effective citizenry, and I guess not community revitalization. So I've seen a lot of the foundation over the years.
I'm Kelly Nowlin. I'm a 5th generation family member and have served on the Surdna Foundation board for the last 4 years. So I don't have that longevity, but I do have a lens that's a little unique, as I was a founding member on the first family program that the Surdna Foundation put together. And one of the arms of that was the Andrus Family Fund, which is a grant-making institution for 5th generation family. And I was a founding board member on that back in 2000 and had an experience very unique in kind of growing that grant-making aspect of it and experiencing the learning there. And then subsequently serve on the Surdna board and chair the family program, chair the Family Involvement Committee, which oversees our outreach to next generation family. And I'm actually from Hopkinton, Massachusetts. I did not run here,
but you could have. That's the key.
And it was really cool I used to live in the city and got up early this morning and walking down, walking the Charles River again and taking that all in was kind of cool. So it's nice to be here in Cambridge, not out in the burbs.
Nice to be in Cambridge in the spring. It seems like every time I come here it's cold and damp or something, but beautiful. So Philip Henderson, I'm the president of the Surdna Foundation, and I've been at Surdna for 7 years, believe it or not. David, 7 years already. I think the thing that's interesting about that, if there is an interesting thing about 7 years, is that I'm only the 2nd president of the foundation. And part of the story of Surdna is the evolution over time, and so I took over for the first ever professional leader of the foundation, Ed Skloot, who was with the foundation for 19 years. And it's been just really a pleasure both to get to know the Andrus family, and you heard a little bit from Libby, the deep modesty that makes us a little bit unsure about how to talk about the fact that we're 100 and approaching 100. but the family is really quite a remarkable and large group of people, and the work that's been done under the auspices of the foundation I find fascinating, and so I'm really looking forward to sharing some insights about that today, David.
Thank you, Phil. The reason when he said 7 years and then he mentioned me is that I'm connected to the Surdna Foundation because I was one of the first 2 non-family members to be added to the board after a mere, 70 years of waiting to do that. And it was on the search committee that hired Phil. And then just to be sure that people who don't know about Surdna is going to just know the areas in which Surdna works. Phil, would you just quickly reiterate the programs?
So we have, since I arrived at Surdna, reoriented ourselves around a fresh new mission, which is about sustainable communities, with the value of social justice really deeply embedded in our work. And we have 3 main areas of focus: strong local economies, sustainable environments, and thriving cultures. And we really look to see how all 3 of those contribute to making communities that we want to live in, that really address the social ills of many of the communities we're in. So,
thank you. So almost 100 years, and if we're imagining a timeline that begins in 1917 and takes us right to the present, I wonder what you would consider main events. What would be highlights on that timeline that we can talk about further in this hour?
Well, the things that I think of as really pivotal moments in our history were the time when we decided to hire an executive director. Actually, our first grants were kept in a shoebox. And we went from the shoebox to a part-time consultant who we reviewed. The board book was literally this thick. And we would spend the morning going through every single grant. They were oriented towards education and medicine, but no particular strategy, more a charity model than philanthropy model. And so a book was written by Waldemar Nielsen, and my father, who was then chair, John Andrus, read it, and it describes Surdna as an underperforming foundation, and was very critical. And he decided, well, I think it's time to make a few changes. So they brought on 4 younger family members, I was one of those, and decided to hire an executive director. And that really was the big shift, because then we looked at program areas, and we looked at a different financial model. We hired new managers. We hired Cambridge associates to oversee the investments. So I'd say that was one. Another was the family program, which Kelly will talk about. She's headed, but really thinking about not just working with the board members on Surdna, but also with the younger family members to kind of bring them into the world of philanthropy, not only to become Surdna members or members of the other Andrus philanthropies, but to go back to their communities and serve. So that is another one. And then I think, and this was a big discussion, whether we would have term limits, which we'd never had. You really could stay until you died at the boardroom, and non-family members. And at that point in time, we made a momentous, for us, decision to not always have consensus, but to vote. And in that case, we had to, because there were many members who said, outside members, it's going to ruin the family foundation. We're not going to have the same sense of control. And term limits, they said, no, we want to be on forever. We did vote, and both passed. And they were momentous decisions which have really, really been wonderful for the foundation, particularly the non-family members. And the rotation system meant that we could bring on new generation members like Kelly. So those are kind of the highlights of it.
Good. I think we should revisit every one of those. and Kelly and Phil, would you add anything to the timeline?
I might add that, since my short experience so far, one of the things that I've seen happen is adding more depth to our staff. And it has really enabled Surdna to continue to embrace the high-touch grant-making approach that we really value. And so that not only is it an added learning experience for the board, but our work is more impactful, and we've got a lot of players on the ground and engaging in this work. I think that was a real key moment.
So I think maybe I'll take, surprisingly, I'll go way back before my time, just to give some folks a little context. The first work of the foundation was to establish an orphanage, and then a nursing home, both on properties adjoining each other in Hastings, just north of Yonkers. And for most of Surdna's history, the funding and operation of those homes, we call them the homes, were the primary endeavor of the foundation. And we still have a grant relationship with them. We still have some interlocking, well, we have board members who, like Libby, serve both on the Surdna board and on one of the homes boards, so there is still family connections there. But part of the history of the foundation was moving away from that being the center of what we did to being something that was part of the legacy of the institution that we still care about, we still believe is an important part of what we have done and continue to provide some support to. But then moving on to strategic philanthropy in a really, I think, robust way in the last 25 years, through board leadership, through some of the events that that Libby and Kelly just described. So, sort of reminding ourselves that we're not beholden to what once was. Actually, there were some key moments of transition that happened in the early decades of the foundation's operation as well. And part of the story of the foundation is that evolution over 100 years, where we are really quite a different place than we were in the 30s and 40s and 50s when none of us were around.
Thank you. So let's just let's zoom in on one of these issues that has to do with family and a growing family. At this point, when people say to you, "Well, how many are there out there? How many family members now?" Because you have to start counting the 6th generation. And are there couples out?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. So how many are there?
I mean, the exact number is heading towards 500.
Okay.
So, you know,
I can tell you, David, just a little anecdote.
Yes.
So we have been trying for the last 6 months to update the family tree,
Yeah.
which is itself turns out to be an almost impossible task. But we put up the draft of the family tree on the boardroom wall this week on Monday, and we asked board members to fill in the places where we knew there were gaps, and there were at least 5 or 6 new human beings that were added there that we didn't know. So I think it's a moving target.
thankfully, none were mine.
So this is an issue, perhaps on a larger scale, but it's an issue that all family foundations think about, which is that how do you engage the next generation? Are you going to engage the next generation? What are mechanisms for that? And let's talk a bit, because you mentioned 2 things, Kelly. You mentioned the Andrus Family Fund, AFF, that you were one of the founding members of, which is still relatively recent. And then you mentioned the family program. So talk about it from the point of view of a 5th generation person who's getting sort of introduced to this notion that, wow, there's actually a philanthropic system out here.
Right. Back in 98, as Libby referred to, or referenced that the Surdna Foundation created this family program, this FIC, Family Involvement Committee, to think about, okay, we really care deeply about this being a family-run foundation. How do we sustain that? And at the time, the thinking was about, kind of service on the boards and channeling new faces and thinkers into that. And really the family programs, it didn't go anywhere. It got a little stuck in their discussions. And when they backed up, and Libby mentioned, and began to think about how do you engage younger generations in organized philanthropy from a learning standpoint, from an understanding and respect of the gift of humility and the goodness of giving itself, and maybe embed some values into family members that they can bring back to their own lives, to their own children, to their own communities. When it became authentic like that, the ideas flowed. And one of the first things that was created was this Andrus Family Fund, which is a $4 million grant-making institute that Surdna supports and provides that endowment for. And I had the privilege of being a founding member on that. And we sat around, I never met any of these cousins, and we sat around a room one day for the first time, and I was 7 months pregnant, kind of wondering what the hell am I doing? And we talked about what we cared about in our lives, and there was nothing formed. I mean, there were no programs, there was nothing. And we talked about our passions, and out of that grew the program areas of foster care and community reconciliation. Going further down, we thought about, okay, that was a range of 25 to 44-year-olds that were in this category. But there's all these opportunities of college students in our family, as well as teenagers that were in high school. And so we created, first and foremost, something called the Board Experiential, or at the time it was Board Exploration Triads, BETS, as we call them. And what we did is brought in an expert in the field of one of our program areas. We invited an extended family member, and we had one of the Andrus Family Fund board members serving on this triad to dig deeper into the program work of the Andrus Family Fund. And so it was a way of family engagement, but through learning, through really valuable work and engaging, also in learning from experts that we brought in to kind of really become more strategic grant makers in our program areas. That has subsequently grown into a college-age program that really allows college family members to engage in formalized philanthropy. They serve as a mini board. They evaluate grants. They go and it's facilitated by a professional, and they learn about this experience firsthand. In addition, we added the Andrus Youth Service Program, and that engages 13 to 17-year-olds. And we've had 50 to 60 young family members participate in that. And that's something where it's facilitated again by a professional and somebody with experience, but they're given training and learning and ways in which to go back and do their own site visits to organizations in their own communities. And there's an incentive if they volunteer a certain number of hours in their community at these organizations, they have larger grant money to give. And so it starts at, I think, $750, and it can go up to $1,000. And you find that 90% of these young people will put in their time and subsequently have gone on to shape a lot of what they're doing in college and what they're doing in their own communities. And then the benefit of it, and I'll wrap this up, is the through line is that actually people that have served on the Andrus Youth Program then kind of are interested in maybe serving on BETS, and we see them applying to the Andrus Family Fund to want board service there, and from there, who knows. But that's kind of like the organic piece of it that we certainly hope for that succession, but the idea is not based in that agenda, and I think it's a real experience for the family.
So, Libby, do you want to give your perspective on that? I mean, I can't help but think about, so here are the Red Sox, and here are the Pawtucket Red Sox, and that there's the Pawtucket Red Sox have their own fans, and it's great, but there's this sort of sense there that some of the outstanding folks are going to go up to the major leagues. Is there this feeling that you are consciously cultivating future Surdna board members?
Not necessarily. My sense, in the sense of the committee, originally when we formed this, was that this was to be a learning opportunity in philanthropy, and that the idea was that young people who went through it would go back to their communities and be involved in public service. They would also, if they were interested, could serve on we run a children's home now. It used to be an orphanage. There aren't orphanages anymore. And a retirement residence, which is now actually a nursing home. And they could sort of have the opportunity to go on those boards too. Surdna was another option, and in fact, we've had several by virtue of the fact that they come out so well trained that they're really ready to jump in and be foundation board members. without having to go through a lot of the teaching that we would ordinarily. So, and I would just say one more thing. I have 2 children who, they aren't children, who have been and are on the Andrus Family Fund Board. And my son, who is involved in business and never had any particular interest in the nonprofit world. It's just opened up his world. And he's involved in a program now in the environment and bringing food trucks into poorer areas to provide food for high school kids. He just has a different mindset in the world. My daughter, she hasn't been on that long, but I think it's been really transformative for a lot of these young people.
Thank you. You represent kind of a handoff of generation to generation here. Right now, the Surdna board is 4th and 5th generations. What's that been like for both of you?
I can speak to that. Serving on the Andrus Family Fund, it was all 5th generation. And we kind of thought, we're so cool, and we're a little more risk-taking, and then the Surdna, and we're kind of, innovative, and Surdna gave us that direction, though, too. And to their credit, they said, make us uncomfortable. They said, we are not here to manage and micromanage what you're doing. As long as it fits in with the values of the foundation and the mission, we're really the values, because we created our own mission. They really empowered us to be independent. And so we thought that was pretty neat. And I loved serving with the 5th generation. And when opportunities arose to apply for Surdna, I thought, wow, it's going to be different. It's going to be a little stiff and not. And it has turned out to be a very, very special thing to interact with mixed multi-generations, in this case, 4th and 5th. And my angst now is that the 4th generation's terms are coming to that close, and then it may end up being a 5th generation board again. And so we need to figure out, from a family perspective, how to continue to engage the older generations, because their perspective, their legacy, their knowledge and demeanor just on the board itself is so critical to the success of the Surdna board, of the Surdna Foundation.
Yes, I think certainly the transition from the 4th to the 5th, which we've had, has been a positive one. Not always comfortable, because some of us were kind of committed to our old ideas, but they've served as real learning for us and pushed us in new ways. Kelly, for example, is very good in communications, and so we've learned from her. Others are much more knowledgeable in the tech world than some of us. It's been a positive experience. I think it'll be interesting in the next 3 or 4 years when virtually all of our generation are gone. And not that the foundation won't be in good hands, because I firmly believe it will, but what they will lose is a sense of history and experience. And I have no doubt that they will deal with it well, but it will just be a different kind of environment at the foundation.
So when I asked for highlights on the timeline, Libby, the first thing you mentioned was that moment of having professional staff. So let's actually turn to you, Phil, for a moment, and as the current president and CEO, and I know there are people in the room, of course, who are staff members as well as board members and family members. So I'd just like to ask you. I remember first meeting you seven years ago, and
Even longer.
even longer. It was longer than that, right? And so you were saying this is intriguing. This family foundation. Has there been anything that's surprised you?
Everything, I guess, right, at some level. I guess what I've been thinking about as we've been talking, or as I've been listening in the last few minutes is one of the most interesting things about Surdna as we close in on 100 years, as we move into 5th generation leadership, as we have this vast family, the Andrus family, most of whom, the vast majority of whom don't have the name Andrus. A few of them do. This sort of question of what's the connection, what's the connective tissue of that makes this a family, is something that is, you know, this is the response, right? So in Libby's generation, the folks around the board table, many of them had grown up in places where they encountered each other as family members in one way or another, cousins, direct cousins, or aunts and uncles and whatnot. And Kelly mentioned almost in passing that she was sitting at a table with her family peers and she didn't know any of them, or a few of them. And so trying to figure out what does it actually mean to be a family institution when the self-identification of the individuals is not naturally, as they're growing up, to John Andrus. I mean, how many of us know who our 5 generations ago grandfather was? I certainly haven't the faintest idea. And so part of what these institutions are is the gravitational pull that allows that self-identification to happen. And that for me has been fascinating to be a part of. And I recognize that while I have a job that is most of the time about running a grant-making operation and being a spokesperson for sustainability and sustainable communities, there's this whole other part of the work that's about understanding the nature of the family itself and how expressing Surdna as a family institution matters in ways that are almost abstract, but it matters because it's about expression of values. It's about a sort of deep reservoir of people who really care about the work. It's about having a board that's different than a board of professionals, a board of folks that care about this because this is a legacy for them.
Yes.
You know, I guess if you'd asked me 7 years ago, did I know all that? I probably could have said something like that, but it's much different to have lived it and to experience it. And I find I'm as energized or more energized by that and intrigued by that now as I've ever been. And I wonder, at one of the questions I have in my head, and we had a really interesting meeting of the formerly known as Family Involvement Committee, now renamed the Andrus Family Philanthropy Program Committee. Sorry. We tried to make it easier to remember.
Simplify it.
Yeah, exactly. Just make it, we added about 16 letters on Sunday afternoon, and we were talking about what does it mean to do family engagement. And I think as we move to a 6th generation, really thinking carefully about what does it actually mean when you're dealing with more than 500 people, many of whom, in the absence of this suite of philanthropic entities, the 2 homes, Surdna, Andrus Family Fund, might not have any reason to identify themselves with John Andrus. They would be thinking of their own grandfathers and others who themselves are, anyway, you get the idea. Yeah.
I would just add that this family piece with a professional staff doesn't always work.
It's working beautifully now, though.
In fact, it is working beautifully now.
Collective sigh of relief.
It hasn't always been that way.
No.
And we're a very active board, and we honor the family connection. But I think when Phil came in, he really took up that mantle and took the family piece as important to him. That message has gone to the staff, and it's a very, very comfortable staff-board working relationship. And clearly, the money is not ours to give, it's a public charity, but the family piece is an overlay that is honored by Phil. And that wasn't always the case, and I think isn't always the case. It takes a lot of work.
So Phil, you were describing, since you are the real liaison with the board as a staff member, it makes a lot of sense that you'd be thinking about these matters. But Libby just mentioned the rest of the staff.
Yeah.
And I'd love your impression of what difference does it make that they're working for the Surdna Foundation as opposed to the Rockefeller Foundation, something where it's no longer, it may have begun as a family enterprise, but it's now not considered a family foundation.
Yeah, it's hard to put my finger on what that is exactly, but I'll share with you that I was, one of the surprising things for me in the last year or so was we had some conversations with the staff about the way they see their role in this institution. And the familyness of the institution is something that they express as being important to them. And I think they too, I mean, I think, Libby, you're right, and I appreciate the feedback that, you know, it does start with me. If I was spending a lot of my energy saying this is not that important, just ignore it, just go about your work, it would be perhaps different. But I think people are both respond to the notion that the board, as a sort of sense of leadership of the family, matters, and that helping them understand the work matters, and not seeing that as a distraction from the work, but a core part of how we express our values as an institution. I think somehow it infiltrates everything in a way. And what's pleasing to me is that the staff, I mean, in a way, we've had a lot of turnover in the last 7 years as my new leadership came in, and you know, out with the old, in with the new, I suppose, in a very gentle Andrus way. But people were attracted to that vision, right? So we have people who have self-identified as being intrigued by that this is not just a technical apparatus here to give away money, but it's a collective work that feels like family. And I would just say I've mentioned already some things that have happened this week. We had a board meeting on Monday and Tuesday, and on Monday we spent the day in Queens looking at some work that we're funding through our Thriving Cultures program. We brought everybody, the receptionist, all the staff, all the board. We hopped on the buses together and went out to Corona, and it was great, completely great. And you know, it was 40 plus of us trooping around museums and whatnot, and it was very comfortable. And I think that's a great work environment. I think people really like that feeling that we have that's sort of under the surface, but
Nice.
appears in those ways.
Yeah. Kelly, you want to add something?
I did want to add something, just on what Libby mentioned, that it didn't always work very well, this family dynamic and this piece. And one of the key, I think, moments in time for the foundation was when they created a nominating committee. And so when they bring on and look at family members to serve on the board, it is not, well, you have Andrus in your name somewhere and you're on this tree and cool, you know, that would be great. I can attest, I had 7 interviews. I mean, literally 7 different interviews, and I had references checked, and I had an in-person meeting, and it really is a key component. As awkward as that sounds, you know, in a family to do that, there was issues that have arisen in the past, and that, you know, certain board members were asked to leave, and so there's conflict there. And so unless, you know, they felt that, not that you bought into their, you know, everything, but that you had to embrace a sense of the values of this and the mission of this foundation.
Are there specific criteria that are used for bringing board members on?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and one of which is, you know, do you get a sense that a person would embrace the values, embrace the mission of social justice and sustainable communities, and do you have that, you know, similar belief system to the most part, and then also, what have you done in your own community? What is the need right now on the board? A need that perhaps I was able to fill a little bit was the communication strategy piece, and thinking about foundation work in a strategic way as it relates to social media and powering stories in the field. And so we think about those gaps as well. But it was quite a process, and it was not, you realized how serious the board took that, and I think that makes a key difference.
So, go ahead, Libby.
I think one thing we learned in this process is that prospective board members really have to understand that we are focused on the work, and we're focused on the strategy of the work and the mission of the foundation. And we have a lot of branches in the family, and this is not a vehicle for our personal giving. And to me, that's kind of key to why we've lasted so long. With all these branches, you know, Kelly's branch does not choose what they want to do. Our branch does not. In fact, the grant making, you know, unless it fits very specifically into our guidelines, it doesn't happen. So individual board members are on committees and we offer advice on strategy. We work with them on strategy. But we don't say, I'm from Minneapolis, The Minneapolis Institute of Arts is one of my favorites. It has great programs. I think we should fund it. It just doesn't happen, which I think has been very valuable in keeping us focused on the work and not on our own individual. So when we have board members, they don't always understand that, and they need to understand that.
You mentioned that you now have non-family board members.
Yeah.
And how did you arrive at that decision? It was difficult, I think you mentioned.
Yeah, it was.
Can you tell me the process that you went through?
Well, we had a retreat, and we had a lot of discussion about it. And as I said earlier, some people were threatened by that and thought we would lose control completely. And, you know, why do we want outsiders? And but it was passed, and we very carefully chose the first two board members, who not only because of their skill set, but also were individuals that we thought would embrace the family concept. And he did. I mean, both of them did. They were just fabulous. And I think what the board, even the naysayers, learned very quickly was that this was really adding value to our culture and our work. So it was a process to get there, but it's worked out
Well,
beautifully.
David, you might share,
Yeah.
I was almost going to ask you the funny question of, they did take their time, didn't they?
Well,
But beyond that, once you arrived, I mean, your perspective would be really interesting.
well,
to
sure.
share.
You know, I should say that at the time, I was president and CEO of the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation in New Jersey. And I can't remember exactly, I think it was a phone call or, so anyway, the idea of, well, would you be interested in being, not serving on a board, would you be interested in being a candidate to serve on the board? Would you be interested in being interviewed to serve on a board? Now, this was interesting because, you know, when you're a foundation president, people constantly want you on their board. So I'm very used to saying, no, I can't, I'm too busy, da, da, da. But here's the sort of thing, would you like to be interviewed, to be considered to be on the board of a foundation? I said, couldn't resist. So I said, okay, all right. So I went in and I didn't have 7 interviews, but I had one long interview where at one point I sort of said, no, wait a minute, is this to be a board member or the CEO? Because the situation was exactly like if you were interviewing for a job. And of course it was. And then, as Phil indicated, there was a long period of silence when I figured, well, I guess they've moved on. You know, I wasn't sort of waking up every morning wondering if, you know, about if this was going to happen. And then there was a call saying, well, yes, you've been offered this. And I said, wow, that's great. And I realized that they had literally taken months, I don't know, was it like 7 or 8 months of this process to yield 2 new family board members.
We're more efficient now, but.
Well, and I'll just say, you know, it became one of the great pleasures of my life for 6 years because I was able to interact with a different group of people on this really very similar group of topics about what is effective philanthropy. And in fact, the Sustainable Communities had a huge overlap with the Dodge Foundation work in arts and environment and in sort of interdisciplinarity and the like. So I learned a ton and became, you know, really felt what it was like to not be a family member, but be welcomed into a family venture.
Well, and my favorite was that one of our board members, 4th generation, said, the non-family, they make us behave. You know, and it is. It elevates the level of thinking and dialogue.
Yeah.
And
Well, I didn't mention I'm very strict.
sorry.
On the Andrus Family Fund, how do you staff that? Is it a separate entity? Is it what's the relationship with all the staff and legal structure and stuff like that?
Is this time to plug the book?
Oh,
Why don't you?
Yeah, just so many years ago, NCFP wrote a book about this. So if you want to know more, some of it's stale, but most of it's relevant. So it is separately branded, separately run, legally part of Surdna. So we allocate a subset of our budget. Now it's $4 million. It's about 10% of our budget. There's a staff of 3. that are named directors and whatnot of the Andrus Family Fund, but they are all legally part of the Surdna Foundation. But it is, to the outside world, a completely separate endeavor. Separate website, separate logos, separate programming, all of that. And behind the scenes, we're working to make sure that there's integration at the level of values. There's shared services. All the back office services are run by Surdna, but sort of a shared community within which we do the work.
Why was it separated?
I think Libby, you tell the best story about what was the intent here. Why was it created as a separate?
Well, we wanted to give as much autonomy as possible to these young people. We didn't want to tell them, we certainly wanted them to understand our values and to have whatever they did be consistent with our general values. But we wanted them to have the experience from the get-go of designing their own philanthropy. So they went through a retreat and came up with their program areas. They came up with the transitions framework through which they did their work and based community reconciliation on some of Nelson Mandela's principles. But they really operated, not in a vacuum, but very independently. And there were some pluses and some disadvantages to that. So we've kind of grown with that model. But we didn't want them to feel that we were looking over their shoulders and saying, you can do this, you can't do that. We had to approve all their grants, ultimately, just from a legal standpoint. But they really formed their own committees. They did everything.
And I think the learning was truly authentic, because of that, and empowered us. But what happens, later is that we created a Surdna AFF Relations Committee because we actually realized that, well, this is silly to operate so separately. And how can we join forces and learn from the Surdna board and staff and vice versa and share resources on our program work and other tools that are out there? I mean, it really is looking and trying to continue to deepen the collaboration. And structurally, it originally was not set up very effectively to do that. The executive director reported to the committee, the family committee, instead of the president of Surdna. And it was great when it was great, but when there were, parts and moments that needed a little more attention or conflicts that arose with staff or, issues, the committee, we were present 4 times a year, and really that oversight, and I don't want to say oversight because you really do still empower them to do their work separately, but the integration of the two boards and staff really now has naturally happened because it's been shifted under Phil's guidance.
And I would just
And report.
I just add, we shouldn't sugarcoat it. It wasn't always easy. And actually, again, with Phil's coming on as president, he embraced this whole family venture, and including the AFF. We didn't always have that. So he wanted to work with them. He wanted to, they are of value to him, and he's made that happen. But it wasn't always that way, and it isn't always easy. So,
Let me say we're halfway through, and usually with these sessions, I think the moderator is way too long to turn to the whole group, and then often they sort of let the most eager questioners take it from there, and people leave with really cool questions that they didn't get to pose. So, I'd like to ask you to do this. I want to just take 2 minutes and ask you by table. Okay, and all of you crowd in the back here, you can sort of have a little conclave.
The non-table
Little
crowd.
conclave, and just say, as a group, if you only had time to ask one question of these 3 folks, what would it be? All right, I'm going to, so you can proceed to have that sort of conversation among yourselves, and please, I beg you, in 2 minutes, when I try to regain order, please then stop talking. Okay, okay, take 2 minutes.
I have another one. It was discussing
Oh my God.
leading up to
family and how do they support the segregation of
above my head.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, I really appreciate the fact that you. Yes. Okay, good. Let's see what you came up with, and we'll try to allocate some time so that we don't leave any groups stranded without their question answered. Could we begin here?
So I thought that, I really enjoyed how you guys were talking about the structure now, where you have the Andrus Youth Program rolling up into BETS, rolling up into the Family Fund, and then rolling up under Surdna. But I missed, I don't know, maybe if you covered it in the first minute or two, I missed, John Andrus, I guess was he the 97 years ago, the main guy. And just looking in the book here at page 17, you've got the foundation was established in 1917, and then you've got a date of 1928, then 1953, and then we jump with a lot more detail after 98. So I was wondering what happened between. So, I mean, like, we may all aspire to get to where we have 4 levels of involvement and 500 members. We are not, our family is not that old yet. And so what happened between 17 and 1998? And did you say, Libby, that this momentous vote was in, what year was that, to bring in outside board members?
Oh, what year was it? I'm not sure.
It's 2004, because I
Oh,
joined in 2005.
You know, okay. No. But you're asking what happened programmatically, or what happened in terms of
No, just the whole
family
history,
outreach?
like, so it started with a family. Was John Andrus
Uh-huh.
the
Yes.
97 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then so it was just a strictly family all the way up until 2004.
Yes. Well, actually, no. There was an attorney and one of the bank representatives who served on the board for a period of time, early on.
Maybe I take a crack at just sort of getting into this subject. I mean, we have these people filming us right now, which is a little intimidating, but they've been doing some filming for us precisely because it's remarkable how little we really know as an institution about what happened, particularly before 1990. We have these milestones. We know about the 2 homes, and we know we gave a bunch of medical scholarships and other things to universities, because I get letters every year telling me how great the scholarships are from the 60s. But the stories of that era really were not well documented. And we are beginning to lose the voices of people who were experiencing them, people who are significantly older than Libby, who were around during that time. There are very few of them. And so part of what we're doing is trying to film and have people tell stories about what was really going on back then. And we're beginning to piece together what we think is a narrative about that era. But much of the detail is really lost to history in a way. I mean, we have archives up in Iron Mountain, like all you do, that will, someday we'll hire an archivist who may go through and write a dissertation about this. But it's one of the lessons I've had over the last 6 or 8 months as we've begun to do this project is it's very hard to have a single narrative about this is what happened at the Surdna Foundation. There are multiple narratives, multiple experiences, multiple stories, some of which connect, some of which don't. And part of what we're trying to do is weave that together into some sense of an answer to your question, which is how exactly did we get where we are? And we have a really good sense of what the last 25 years have looked and felt like. And before that, it's more ethereal. So.
And even going through this process we're doing now of gathering facts, in fact, aren't facts. They're memories. And so if you think about going into a museum room and looking at a group of Impressionist paintings, all of Saint-Chapelle or whatever, you're going to have everyone a little bit different. And I think that's what we're finding in terms of our fact gathering, our memories, which are all quite, they vary.
And the index cards in the shoebox, they're a little bit tired and weathered at this point. So those.
So before we leave this corner, Sir, you have another question? Or?
I did actually. Is there a mechanism in place within the Andrus family to assist the education from generation to generation about the philanthropic legacy of the family? That's one. And then the other part is, there's not a lot, but there are a few families that are on the process or have already celebrated their century within philanthropic giving. The Rockefellers, obviously the Andrus are coming up to that, Fords, et cetera. Have there ever been any opportunities over time to convene with families who have a similar level or length of history in terms of how they have consistently maintained that engagement, specifically around family values over time?
Well, you know, and I will say it's interesting, the others that you mentioned, I don't think would call themselves family foundations.
Sure.
No.
Right.
So that, my understanding is that there are a couple of smaller family foundations where there's been the continuity of family governance. But I'm not even sure, I mean, there's not many people to talk to about this.
Yeah.
And some of the research that we've begun to do with foundations that have experienced a moment in time like this is look how they went about honoring that or marking that. And it's informed us in our centennial planning to really not go out there and talk about Surdna and tell our grand story, that we actually want to do and celebrate this occasion by embedding it into our work, looking at centennial grant making, looking at ways in which to engage the family, but not to just say, look at all we've done, you know, in 100 years. It's really embedding it into the values and the work. And so we're coming at it a little more, maybe a little different than we've noticed some others have done in the past. So, but it's always worth finding those people to talk to.
So on the education piece, I think it's worth sharing a couple of thoughts. One is I think all of the suite of family programming that we do for the younger generation could be interpreted as part of that education, the bringing through of the values. But I had this experience last summer of attending a subset of the Andrus family's, a branch of the Andrus family's reunion. It's the Griffith branch. I guess we call them the Griffith branch, right? And there are about 55 of them, which for most of us would be a big family, but this is a subset, right? And they do a family reunion every 4 years, and they do it for a week. And so they were at Estes Park there's a YMCA facility there. If you've never been, it doesn't look and feel like any YMCA I've ever been to, but it's great. So I was there for an afternoon because they had, in the evenings, they had sessions about things. So they had one about, travel logs, and then they had one about philanthropy. And they had this very intentional 2-part session. It was like being at a seminar where they sat in a circle, and first with one of the family elders, he would not call himself an elder, but I think we could imagine him as an elder, who was a retired Stanford professor, led the group through a reflective conversation, and this was 14-year-olds up to 85-year-olds all in the room together, talking about what does it mean to be a family that engages in philanthropy, and how do you do that well? And what does clumsy philanthropy look like? So this was mesmerizing to watch. The family would be so intentional about going through that process in a very authentic way, and not, it wasn't silly at all. And then the second part was talking about the formal work that's happening under their names, the Surdna and AFF and these other things, spoken through the voices of family members who'd actually been engaged in these things, board members and other participants. So I've never encountered any other thing like that in terms of really consciously spreading the thinking deeper into the family and having the generations talk to each other about that. Very impressive.
Thank you, Phil. I'm going to turn to the next 5 tables. I'm going to do a little timekeeping of just 5 minutes per each. How about this table?
So we were wondering, you mentioned that Surdna is not a vehicle for personal giving, which makes a lot of sense in order to move things forward. But when did that happen? It must have started as a vehicle, but maybe it didn't.
When was the transition to more?
When did it stop being?
And how?
When did the board decision stop being your personal giving?
When we hired an executive director. And even before that, there were areas of giving, but they were education, the arts, medicine. So there were those very general areas, and they were very general. But when we hired our first executive director and the board had a retreat and really delved into what we wanted to accomplish, what we thought the main areas of need were. We chose a couple of them, and we then stopped kind of personal giving.
So ideas were not brought in from board members at that time?
Well, ideas could be brought in, but more at that level, it was, for instance, at one of the retreats, we each did a research project on an area that we wanted funded. And so we came in and presented the research we'd done. I did something on the arts and something on children, and presented, and then we voted, and then we had experts come in to kind of get down deep on what we could do, what the gaps were. But we really then built a culture of, we're going to focus on this work. We're not going to focus on Libby likes this and Kelly likes this. So, and it worked pretty well. There were always, there are always times when certain people say, oh, but this really is a good fit, and it isn't.
Yes?
Just to elaborate on that question a little bit more, were some people offended when you kind of said, great presentation, but overall it doesn't fit what the organization as a whole wants, and we think that's great and you should continue to support that individually? Were people offended? Did people have maturity to understand that and accept that? What were the family dynamics around that conversation?
I think people were disappointed, but I wouldn't say offended. And I think the group came together and embraced the decisions that were made.
You might say there is a safety valve, or a pressure release valve called
with the
discretionary
discretionary?
dollars, which is one way of dealing with this. We're lucky because we have the resources to do that, but you might talk a little bit about how the discretionary works.
Well, we each, not originally, but at a certain point in time, were allocated discretionary dollars. So right now, we can give away $40,000 a year to areas of our interest. So they don't have to fit the foundation guidelines. They're things that we individually care about, which is a wonderful, wonderful gift. But we're not.
Each or total? Is that board members only?
Board members only.
Board members only.
So, and that includes the non-family?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it did. And, I have to say, at the Dodge Foundation, which is not a family foundation, we had the same policy because we have the exact same dynamic, which is board members come to the table, of course, with their own passions. And a way to diffuse that, a way to avoid the awkward trying to shoehorn or fit something that doesn't quite fit, was to say, this is why we have discretionary giving.
Yeah.
And this discretionary giving is totally not related to.
It doesn't.
No, it doesn't matter.
No, it has to be a 501c3.
501c3.
501c3. It has to be, yes, something that people around the table would say, oh,
Yeah,
this is worthy cause.
Right.
Not self-serving.
Not self-serving.
It's legally vetted.
It's worth
They're all
saying. It's
disclosed.
worth saying that we also request that the receiving entities do not advertise this because we don't want the general audiences to presume that we are now supporting
Yeah.
school reform or other things that might be implied through these individual things. But it turns out to be a pretty. It's useful also because we don't compensate our board members at all.
No, we don't.
And so this is another way to provide them with some sense that their time is valued. So
Thanks. Let's turn to this table.
Could you talk more about these transition points? You went through very predictable transition points where at first is your sort of individual giving vehicle, then you have a strategic plan, and then you hire staff, and then you bring outside board members in. You've gone through this. More about what prompts each of those. Why did you do them? And what can we learn about, when do you know it's time to take that next step? What could we learn about, okay, it's time we get a strategic plan and do, impact giving. Now it's time for staff. How do you know? How should we know?
I think, so I'll be the warm-up act here. And David, you should feel free to engage in this as well. I think Libby's reminding us that an outside observer was key to the initial push to up our game. This was in the early 80s, a book about philanthropy citing Surdna as an underperformer, something like the name of their foundation isn't the only thing that's backwards about Surdna, right? Surdna, Andrus. You know, that's like a right there, right? And so
I could galvanize you to action.
So, you know, that was a pretty clear signal that the resources and the reputation were not being deployed in a way that was commensurate with the possibility. And so, in every case, that wasn't the case. But I think that's an important signal that, you know, we really care about doing high quality work. And I think a lot of the changes are about saying the way to get to high quality work involves things that are uncomfortable. And there are limitations, for example, of having an only family board where you don't avail yourselves of outside expertise. And I think I would guess that was being felt, that there were opportunities to bring in other voices that wouldn't threaten the legacy of the institution, but would allow us to up our game. I'm not sure that that's true, but I suspect that that's behind a lot of these things.
And I think, I think in hiring Phil, a part of what we wanted came out of what we'd done before that both worked and didn't work. Both in terms of the perhaps lack of focused or silo areas of our giving, and in terms of the way staff and board work together. So when it came time for a change, there were lessons that we had learned about what had worked and what we really didn't want to. And that was an impetus to, for instance, hire Phil and then really, really do the hard work of developing a mission statement, which we had not really had. We had something that was out there, but we never looked at it, didn't guide any of our work. So I don't know whether that answers your question at all. But
I would just add that staff has helped trigger a lot of these pivotal moments and shifts, just with their knowledge about the field, with the conditions and policy that changes out there. We have to be, adaptable. We have to continue to refine and always look at our strategies around our work itself. And so they give us insights and learning in the field that triggers maybe a moment of shift, a moment of change in some of the work and the approaches.
This brings to mind something else, and David, you could speak to this, because I think one of the things that the Surdna board has often asked itself over the years is, are we doing the right thing? Like, are we doing what good foundations do? What do other foundations do when they're in this situation? I mean, we certainly don't have all the answers. And the good news is, while there may not be other family institutions that are quite as old as Surdna or quite as big, there are lots of other philanthropic experiments going on.
Yeah.
And part of what David did, and Najish Mavonian, who was his partner in crime as the first non-family board members, is they were both philanthropy people. And so they were able to provide some context for, well, this is maybe not quite the way most foundations handle it, or you are really trying something useful here. I don't know if you
Well, I feel like what both Nadia and I brought were the core questions of professional philanthropy. And you have to become a learning culture, what I call an assessment culture, where you are saying, what's worth doing, what's happening in the world, what are the needs of the world, what are we going to do, how would we know if we're successful? All those questions, if they become part of of what you talk about, create a sense that there may be a gap between what's happening now and your aspirations. And finally, I think that's the only thing that moves people to say it's time to change, because they're moved by a vision of what's possible and a little bit of a distance. There's a change theory that I subscribe to, which is that not only do you need a vision of where you want to head and a sense of first steps of how to get there, but there has to be sufficient dissatisfaction with the status quo. Mm-hmm. And that's hard in philanthropy, because people are thanking you all the time and you're doing good work. So the difference between so-so philanthropy and kind of bold or daring or highly effective philanthropy is a question of the people around the table saying, creating their own dissatisfaction, and then saying, it's time for us to try something. Let's move to this table.
We had two questions that we put together into one, and 2.5.
You're allowed.
Well, they
but you still only have 5 minutes.
Not to worry. So it's building on the question that you asked before, but I'm curious, we are all curious about more specifics about how you train the next generation. What is it that you want them to learn? How do you teach it? And how has that changed over time? And more specifically, how do you teach them about the values of the founders and the current values of the foundation? How do you pass on that legacy? And then a specific question is, how big is your board?
How many members?
13. That's the easy one. Okay, you guys do the hard
Yes,
one. I got that down. 13.
On the AFF or Andrus Family Fund, there are 12, and no non-family on the Andrus Family Fund at this time. You know, I lived it from the beginning because we came in with this blank slate on the next generation philanthropy, and we talked about passions that kind of informed our programs. We worked on mission. We worked on our statement of values, our core values, and kind of brought that connection around as a board dynamic and culture. And we would actually read our mission and core values before every single board meeting we had. We would always go around the room and each take a sentence and read it and kind of ground us and remind us. And a lot of those core values reflect the family values, right? So a big through line value that came, I felt, you can feel strongly from 1917, from John Emery Andrus, is this idea of humility. He was called the millionaire strap hanger because he rode the train and held those straps on the train just like every other person, and would go into work every day, and even intentionally naming the Andrus, you know, foundation, the Surdna Foundation. There's a humility there, and I think that appreciation has really carried through, and so those core values were written with that in mind. We had to learn really clearly what board and staff roles were. We were clueless. We had some board members that thought you micromanaged the executive director, and you were involved in every decision being made, and that created a situation where the executive director almost left, and you know, because he had come in with more experience, and the family members, we didn't have that experience. So we went through some training and learning there, brought in fellows and outside facilitators in some cases to guide us in that work. We had to be guided and taught about governance and bylaws and some of the legal things. And so there were resources from Surdna that helped us to do that. But even around the work itself, the programs, we were not experts in those fields. And so we engaged 2 fellows, and I want to say maybe from NYU and from different universities that were deep in those fields. And they came in and worked with us for a good year or 2 on really refining our strategies around the work. That was huge. Looking at evaluation tools, that was a big one. You know, how do you evaluate grants? And so that was a lot of, you know, pieces. And you know, and there was so much. But I think the key question that I always tried to answer is, how do we create a meaningful experience in that? We paid a lot of attention to our own transitions. We had check-ins before every board meeting. What's going on in your life? What are you struggling with? How are you doing? How's your family? You know, we would really take time and value that check-in and that connection time. We just didn't roll up our sleeves and jump into the work. We had board dinners. We had retreats, and we had, you know, site visits. And this quote, you know, really embraces, I think, the feeling of, this was a current AFF board member, who says, sometimes it feels odd to me to be having this very 1% experience here on Madison Avenue. I want to go to where the work that we are funding is happening and learn from our grantees. Are there things other than grants that we can provide to these organizations so that we can really call ourselves a social justice organization? I don't know, but I want to do more of that. I want to help them grow and lend my expertise to seeing that happen. And I think just the attitude alone created the opportunity for real learning and getting in, you know, we would call, board members were allowed on AFF to call up the heads of these nonprofits and talk directly and ask questions to them, not to vet them, but just to learn. And then actually we would be empowered to then report back to the board about the grantee that was up for review, and not with a skewed, agenda, but really just what we had learned, the questions and the answers we got from the leaders from those organizations. And that embedded us in a lot of that learning. But before that could happen, the structural piece of it, the governance piece, we tripped a lot.
Phil, I want to move on, if that's okay. Do you,
Yeah.
do you have a quick thing to add? Because
I just want to say that I think part of your question implies that there is a thing that everybody has to learn, but actually this is it's a living institution. And so we're adding new voices to that. And so the trick is to figure out how all those voices fit together. And there are some things that we feel like are truisms, but a lot of this is in motion. And so it's growing all the time.
Right, this is more like when new
Yeah.
board members
Yeah.
come on,
Well,
do they have training?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and the obvious thing to add is that you're willing to invest in their capacity.
Absolutely.
Which is, not just in the capacity of your grantees, but in the capacity of your boards and your staff.
And trust in their leadership
Yeah.
to lead us forward, absolutely.
Let's ask this table.
We were interested in knowing more about that decision from moving from a consensus-based board to a majority decision-making process. We wanted to know what was this like, and when did the need to stop pleasing everyone become evident and give you the ability to maybe move on?
Well, the pleasing everyone isn't done yet. If you're on a non-family board, you don't feel like you have to please. But if you're looking at your cousin and you have a profound disagreement, we had to learn how to disagree. And it was hard, and it is hard. We've gotten much better. And you asked about the voting. Okay, so that really happened. I was chairing then, and we were looking at these two areas of non-family board members and term limits. And the conversations could go on for hours and days and meetings and years. And it was just, we just would be spinning our wheels and not getting anywhere. So we just posed the question, if we can't agree after respectful conversation and consideration of everybody's views, should we have a vote? And most people thought that that was a good idea, and that was huge.
Yeah. I think leadership matters. I mean, Libby was chair at the time, and she wanted to move things along. And I think, it's easy to be chair and do nothing or wait around and hope that nothing bad happens. But I think, leadership really matters in these institutions, and and as Libby says, it's even more challenging when you're in this business, right? When your cousins are around the table, it's really hard sometimes to drive forward. But I think David's right that it was clear the aspirations were high, and
they were,
and that was the motivating factor, it seems to me.
And is the majority 1 over half? Is that the majority vote? A simple majority?
Simple majority.
Simple majority.
Mm-hmm.
It does remind me that something I've always felt about organizations is that there are board members and then there are board chairs, and that there's a special place in heaven for board chairs because it's the only position who can turn to other board members and say, we have to deal with a problem here, and my position requires me to resolve this, often with you. And so I think if there's a mistake that all organizations make sometimes, it's when the board chair comes up, it's, well, who's been there the longest or who expects to be the board chair, instead of having actual criteria for becoming board chair.
And then there's that one little dynamic of being maybe a younger generation and dealing with conflict or process with an older generation that you are just like your parents. And so chairing a committee and trying to move a process forward, sometimes you don't know how to, it's been hard. I've had to really learn how to do that, and I'm still learning, and it's still hard to try to redirect maybe a 4th generation family member, because I'm I'm a fifth generation. I haven't earned that stripe yet. And so there's a little bit of that takes some learning and time and respect.
Thank you. As a follow-up to the governance question, thank you for this book. I think it would be remarkably helpful and interesting probably to many in the room.
And it's also available online.
Perfect, thank you. Just to know more about the governance procedures and some of these policies as you move forward, to the extent that the family would be willing to be transparent about some of these policies and procedures. I think there's a huge interest in the room in understanding how, from a governance standpoint, you addressed issues like board selection and nomination and the creation of the fund and the like.
I would just say on the governance issue that one of the challenges that we have had and have today, they're a little bit different, but are the difference between governance and management. And I know in my era when I first came on, no experience, and was asked to help interview a prospective staff member, I did, and I voiced my opinion very strongly and very clearly, not realizing at that point that that really wasn't my job, and that, you know, I did learn that. And I think today the issue that we might have with this new, very educated, professional fifth generation is that some of them come in with like experience as our staff. And I think there's a challenge for those members to know where they are. You know, am I supposed to wear a program officer hat, or am I acting as a board member? And so we still, you know, that's always a challenge. It changes.
And it's, again, up to the board chair, when you start to creep into that territory, to just remind people of those roles. We have, I think we still have a group in the back corner, is that right, that has a question?
So we had two questions, both related. One was just related to the family fund. At what age you start bringing folks on? So a very specific question. And then the broader question is really, you know, many times when institutions start bringing on staff and, quote, professionalizing the organization, it signals a shift away from family involvement. And in your case, you've had, in some ways, the reverse and seem to have really embraced it and done really wonderful things with it. And I'm curious, when it hasn't worked, because it sounds like it's going maybe better now than it had at other points in the history, when it hasn't worked, what were those things that weren't working and how did you fix them?
I'll answer quickly the age piece of it, and then maybe turn to one of you for the other.
You can answer the harder one.
25 years old for the Andrus Family Fund, and then you can be entering your 45th year and still be eligible. So if you go over that age, it's the 25 to 45. If you go over that age while you're in your term there, that's okay. But if you're coming on within that at that age range, then it works.
As a follow-up to that question, is there a nominating committee to be on the Andrus Family Fund, or is anyone who is 25 to 45 eligible?
There is, and actually one of the pieces that Surdna empowered AFF to do was to create their own nominating committee. And so AFF, the board itself, along with staff, actually go out and solicit applications and then go through an interview process on their own.
And there are family members who have tried, applied, and not been nominated, not been accepted, and that's a very interesting challenge for a family.
Yeah, it is.
So I think on the other question, I'll just take a stab at this just to give Libby a rest. But I think this negotiation, this period in the 1990s, so professional staff were hired in the very late 80s and into the early 90s, and this period in the 1990s where the board and staff had to actually actively define what's the difference between what staff people do and what board people do, with the fact that this was a family foundation and the family wanted to remain in the governance chair in an authentic way and have this still be a family foundation, that was a very turbulent period, and I think necessarily so, because you were in a period of renegotiating. You were negotiating new roles, in fact. And I think, I benefit from all that heavy lifting that happened because I got here, and while we still occasionally have those moments where you think, ooh, that doesn't feel quite right, all the ways that you heard Kelly and Libby expressing the sense of what the board does and doesn't do are the product of that period of wrangling, really. And I think it was important for the staff to create a strong position there because it really created some boundaries that then allowed the board and the family to figure out, well, how do they relate to that? But it, I'm sure, Libby knows, because she lived it, was not a lot of fun. But I think it was an important part of the growth of the institution. We would not be where we are now, feeling pretty good about how we interrelate if we hadn't gone through that period of creating the boundary.
No, it was difficult. But I think one thing that always helps or makes it easier is if you have a very good leadership, both on the professional staff and board chair, because they really set the tone.
Yeah.
And we had a period of real difficulty with board staff relationships, or at least perceived difficulty. I don't know that it was actually that bad. But we did go through that difficult time. Board learned, staff learned that we wanted to be an engaged board. And what that meant, we had to figure out. But we go to site visits, we go to convenings. We're a board that really wants to be engaged in the work. And we're on 4 conference calls a year for each program. We take turns sharing leadership, chairing the program committees. And I think we've reached now kind of a point where the staff and the board feel very comfortable working with each other. We've always said to the staff, we want to know what we haven't done well. You tell us our successes, you tell us what we've done well, you tell us what we think we should do next, but we want to know what our failures are and how we can learn from that.
Great, thank you. So we're at the end of our allotted time. We can all tune in when the filmmakers here enter the Sundance Film Festival in a couple of years with the 100th anniversary video. But thank you all, and please thank Phil and Kelly and Libby. And also, as you leave, you should know that this is Kelly's birthday.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Kelly. Happy birthday to you.
Family Philanthropy. That's awesome.
Is she staying in New York or?
I think it's in the East Coast.